John. So hopefully most of you have checked out the website, seen the email, and have actually, have the bios for Logan and Conan in front of you. What's really exciting today is we have Logan from Boston, something we normally can't do. So we figured, if we're doing virtual, we might as well have a little extra fun. So Logan's Deputy Director of Real-Time Applications for MBTA, the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority. He's in charge of all real-time information for the agency, including a lot of tooling for mobile bus dispatching. Conan is here in LA. He serves as the Senior Executive Officer for Service Development at Metro. He's responsible for bus and rail service changes and system-wide service policies. So with that, both of them are joining us today with that lens of, data is a big part of their day jobs. And lately that's a little different with COVID. So Logan, Conan, thank you very much for joining us. I'm very excited.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Go ahead, if you guys have your slides, go ahead and you should be able to take over share screen if you'd like to. If not, let me know.
Conan, what order do you want us to go in?
Whoever feels ready. That's great.
Logan, you want to go first?
Sure, I will. I got mine queued up. So, I think whoever's the host might need to turn on screen sharing.
Let's see. I keep changing the settings on me.
But while you're working on that, I'll just say thank you for having us. I'm like Vicky mentioned, I'm from the MBTA in Boston, the transit agency for the region. Got a few other folks from the Boston area here, which is exciting. And I want to thank Nina in particular for inviting me to come participate. It's yeah, definitely exciting to take advantage of the fact that everything's virtual now. We can have some more transcontinental communication, right? And I will note, I know I already said this earlier, but got my donkeys. I'm here, got my donuts, got my data, all set to go. So, all right. Oh, I'm able to share now. So let me pull up my slides. All right, folks can see that. All right. So yeah, what I'm going to be talking about today is some work that we've been doing here at the MBTA to share crowding information out to riders. So, like I mentioned, I pulled together some last-minute slides about okay, yeah, transit in Boston, what does that look like? I think it's in my employment contract that I have to mention that the MBTA is the Western Hemisphere's oldest subway system, older than New York. So on the left, you can see said oldest subway being constructed as streetcars are routed around it. Fun fact, they dug out sort of bodies as they were excavating Boston Common to build this, to build the first subway. It used to be a graveyard, used to be all sorts of stuff. On the right, I've got some images that sort of show what my department does at the MBTA, the Customer Technology Department, but that big image with the countdown sign, that is that same subway station over 100 years old now, and now we've got some real-time information in there. So, so getting into things a little bit here, this is a graph. I wanted to start with this graph because this shows what our ridership has looked like since the pandemic began. So we've got all of our different routes indexed at 100% pre-pandemic, and you can see how ridership has declined across our different modes. So our subway modes, our bus mode, our commuter rail mode. And I think Conan will probably tell you that he's seen a similar trend in LA, and other agencies will say the same thing, is ridership has declined a lot overall, but for us, it has declined the least for our bus riders. And if you were to dig into that data some more, what you would see is it has declined the least in general for riders who are core transit riders, who don't have the flexibility to work from home, who don't have other options to commute. These are our most vulnerable riders during normal times, and COVID times. These are essential workers. They're putting themselves in challenging and sometimes dangerous situations just to to keep going. So these are the riders who we really, as transit agencies, need to be serving right now, and these are the riders who we are trying to do right by sharing this crowding information and addressing this crowding concern. So, if you were to ask me, and I feel like most transit agencies, in February, are you interested in sharing, live crowding, live ridership data with your riders? We'd say, yeah, that'd be nice. Like someday we'd like to not just tell people when the bus is coming or when the train is coming. We'd also like to tell them how full it is. Yeah, cool. Well, with the pandemic, that pretty in short order went from yeah, that'd be nice to do someday to a, wow, we really need to start sort of looking at this right now. But in the Customer Technology Department of the MBTA, we try to be a user research driven organization. So we we realized though that while we were excited about digging into this problem, we actually didn't really know what it was like to ride transit during the pandemic. That our entire department, we're not folks who need to go into work every day. We're working from home. We don't represent all of our riders even during normal times, and we certainly didn't know what it was like, what the frustrations and the anxieties were like of riders during this sort of like generationally challenging time. So we stepped back, we said, okay, let's do some user research. Let's talk to riders who are using the MBTA, relying on our service, and make sure that we're solving the right problem for them. And normally what we would do is we would go and actually talk to these riders, right? We go out, when we do user research, we like to go out to our platforms, our bus stops, our vehicles, and just talk to people face to face. And obviously that's not something that is safe to do during a global pandemic. So we had to turn to some different research methods. We ended up doing a survey, which is a little unusual for us, and then doing sort of various socially distanced follow-ups over the phone and through digital tools. And I mean, we could spend the whole time talking about the results of this user research because I think they're really interesting. But we heard from over 1,000 riders who were continuing to ride during the pandemic, including a lot of folks who self-identify as having a disability. And I think this is really important, a large number of riders from neighborhoods that continue to see high ridership during the pandemic. So essential workers, again, the folks we need to serve, which is really good to see. So just pulling a few, I think, really interesting sort of tidbits from this research that I think are relevant. Just to come back to this, the riders who are riding right now don't have, many of them don't have other options, right? They're taking transit because they don't have a car. They can't walk to work. They can't bike to work. And many of them are essential workers. Even another sort of piece of information that was sort of humbling and useful for us is that even if we were to give riders perfect real-time information about, how crowded service is at any given moment, it's not always actionable. If you're an essential worker, oftentimes those are hourly jobs. You have to be at work at a certain time. They don't have flexibility in terms of when to travel or to adjust their travel plans. So these quotes are from riders. We asked, well, what would you do if we tell you the next train is crowded? Many folks said, I would get on it anyway because, I don't want to get sick, but I don't want to get fired either. So I think important sort of context for us as we're doing this work. And then the other thing is, riders said they were interested in getting real-time crowding information, but the research confirmed that still the most relevant information, even in the pandemic, is real-time arrival predictions, right? Folks want to know when their train or when their bus is going to get there. And that's useful for us because I think, we thought about this notion of, oh, do we need like a crowding dashboard? And I think our management was really excited about dashboards. But for riders, they want to see, we decided it would be best to show this information as kind of a supplement to the real-time arrival predictions that riders are used to seeing, in apps, on digital signs, and so on. And then the other major thing this research helped us do was think about kind of the kinds of crowding information that we would show to riders. And I think, if you talk to transit agencies who've been looking into this, they'll say, you've got really sort of two different kinds you can share. There's the real-time information, what's happening right now with service, how crowded is this bus that's out there on the road right now? And there's the historical trend information, right? If I were to leave on a Sunday at 2 o'clock to take our Red Line subway, would it be busy? Would it be not busy? When's the best time to travel? And what we found is that if we're talking about serving essential workers, people who don't have a lot of flexibility in when they travel, real-time data is really what we should be focusing on. Historical trends can be useful, but what we found is that they were most useful for people who have flexibility when they can travel, who are infrequent users, and those aren't characteristics that describe folks who are taking MBTA service right now, or current transit riders. But then the other challenge is that real-time data is hard. We're good at historic crowding data because that's just ridership data. Folks like the MBTA and LA Metro, we have to provide that data to the federal government, to our stakeholders on a monthly basis anyway. So we're good at collecting ridership data, but this notion of telling folks about how crowded a vehicle is in real time and time for it to be useful to them, that was very, very, very new even before the pandemic began. So we decided to focus on real-time crowding data for bus because this is where we sort of felt like the need really was. So we started there. And to be honest, we looked into a lot of, kind of let's call them moonshot technologies, right? We were like, well, gee, can we use machine vision to use our security cameras to count riders on platforms? We had vendors come to us, be like, oh, we can install these doohickeys on your vehicles that'll like count people based on Bluetooth and Wi-Fi and all that. That's all very exciting. Maybe that would be like a really great way of counting people. But the fact is, we were trying to do this in response to a pandemic that is like going on actively, right? We don't really have time to go and install new hardware on all 1,000 plus vehicles. We don't really have time to prove out sort of new tools in a time of this uncertainty. So we decided for bus, we actually were able to kind of repurpose and adapt technology that we already had in the door. So ultimately, where our real-time crowding data is coming from is it's coming from automated passenger counters that most of our buses have had for a long time, because that's what we use to count riders, to report to the feds, and so on. These counters were never designed for live information, but we were able to kind of, make them do what we needed them to do. And so they're sending us those live counts, not over a cellular data connection like you might expect in 2020, but actually over our dispatch radio system. And as you might imagine, sending data over a 20-year-old radio system has certain bandwidth limitations. But that data comes to us. It comes into our CADI, our sort of our bus dispatch system, which is it's a vendor system. It's kind of a black box proprietary system, but we've had it for over 15 years now. We've gotten very good at pulling information out of the system, even though it was not really designed to be sort of an open, flexible system. It doesn't have very robust APIs. So then it goes into an in-house tool that we call BusLoc, which kind of does the math. It takes these counts, these raw counts, and makes adjustments, tries to detect errors, tries to mitigate those errors. It rebalances, make sure that at the end of every bus trip that all riders are off the bus, according to our counts, things like that. From there, that data goes out to our internal tools that our operations staff use, and crucially, it goes into our open data API. So that's the API that powers third-party apps like Google Maps. It powers our website. It powers our digital signs and stations as well. So the other thing I'll say is that accuracy obviously was very important. This is data that most agencies in the US had never shared before the pandemic. Riders weren't expecting it. So we wanted to make sure that this data was accurate. And we were very fortunate that we were able to verify this accuracy by using our security camera footage. Most of our buses have security cameras. And so we basically just said, okay, we're gonna look at how crowded we think the bus is based on all this automated passenger counting equipment. We're going to compare that to manual counts from the security camera footage with spot checks on each and every bus route. That takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort. We were very fortunate that Lena, who's on the call today, and one of our other interns basically spent their entire summer doing this work, reviewing security camera footage, comparing that information. It's hard work, but very important if we're serious about making sure that the information we give to riders is accurate. We also thought a lot about how do we present crowding information to riders. So before the pandemic, there is a specification for crowding information and the spec that transit agencies use to share data with the public. But the way that those categories work is they're in terms like, many seats available, no seats available, like standing room only, which made a lot of sense before the pandemic, but really makes pretty much no sense after the pandemic. The definition of a crowded bus or a crowded train has fundamentally changed. And we didn't have a whole lot to go on. So we decided, again, we're a user research driven department, go out to riders, let's see what categories make sense to them. So we tested different kinds of language to see what made sense to riders. This is what we ended up settling on. So here's our categories, and then this is what that looks like on a 40-foot bus on the right-hand side, these diagrams. And what you'll notice about this language is that it's simple. There's only 3 categories. It uses this color coding and these what we call these bowling pin icons to show how crowded service is. And the simplicity is very deliberate. I think as transit agencies, we can often sort of get a little nervous, be like, oh, we should really, cover our butts and like kind of use some wishy-washy language, like might kind of be crowded, you might not like it. But, if we're serious about serving riders, especially folks who are riding now, who might have limited English proficiency, we need to describe this in ways that are simple and straightforward. So that's how we decided to describe our crowding information. We tested this with riders. Most importantly, this made sense to riders, that they were able to sort of intuit these situations based on these categories. And so now it's live. So starting in June, we launched this on our sort of first 10, our busiest bus routes during the pandemic. So if you're in Boston, you can see this on our digital signs, like this e-ink sign. It's in third-party apps like Transit App, and it's in our official MBTA.com website. And we only started this work in April. This was a real sprint for us. So we're really proud that this was able to get out there sort of in time, I think, to be of use to riders in the pandemic. And we don't, I decided to focus on the rider-facing data for this, but what I'll mention is that, not all riders can take action if they know a bus is crowded. We're glad we can tell riders about crowded service, but we'd much rather have service that's not crowded to begin with. So the other work that we've been doing, which I won't get into too much detail on, is we've been making sure that our operations staff at the MBTA have the information that they need to make adjustments in service. And this might sort of be relevant to other transit agencies, maybe to what Conan's talking about, is that we made sure that as we're detecting sort of this ridership information, these crowding trends, that we're sharing that with our bus garages, folks who are able to make interventions in service. So we send them a daily report. Been doing that since the very beginning of the pandemic of where crowding is happening. If in a different universe, I would like to think that I'd be here talking to you all about our in-house bus dispatch app that we've developed for our field inspectors to use on off-the-shelf tablets. I'm here talking to you about crowding, but I will say that one advantage of having developed an in-house mobile app, web-based web app for our bus officials, is that we were able to incorporate this crowding information into this app, even though it was really new data structure and everything else, able to get this into this app in the same time frame. So all of our bus officials, whether they're in the control center or out in the field, can see what's going on with service and where crowding is happening, which we think is important for for keeping them in the know and giving good service to our riders. So where are we going from here? We've got crowding information released on our busiest bus routes now. We've been releasing more and more every couple weeks. We're planning to release sort of basically this data on all remaining bus routes next month, even routes that aren't particularly crowded right now. We're also, I was sort of poo-pooing historical crowding trend data earlier, but it's all we have for our subway system. So we're going to give it a shot. We're going to see what kind of feedback we get from riders by releasing this crowding trend information and sort of use that to decide whether we want to try something similar for bus. And in general, just because this whole notion of transit agencies publishing real-time crowding information, any kind of rider-facing crowding information like this is new, because the pandemic is so continuously changing. We need to be in constant dialogue with our riders about this work, getting feedback. We're really glad to be talking with folks like LA Metro, other transit agencies about this kind of work, because it's going to be changing. It's going to be, we fully expect that, and they're counting for that. So, and then lastly, it takes a lot of different folks across the agency to sort of make this happen. So I wanted to recognize everyone who worked on this. It was, like I said, 3 months of intense work just to get sort of the first benefits shipped out to riders, and 3 months that were crazy and unpredictable and scary from a professional standpoint and a personal standpoint for many folks. So, we want to appreciate them and say that we're very glad and proud to have gotten this information out there to our riders during this crazy time. And hopefully what we did and what we learned can be useful to other transit agencies as they try to do the same. So appreciate you having me. I was going to say out here in LA, out there in LA. Good to be talking with you all. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Logan. For everybody, we're going to hold questions until the very end. So if we're going to jump right into Conan now.
Right. Let's see. Good morning from LA. Let me try to get my screen up here. All right. Hopefully you can see this. Thank you for inviting me here today. We do use quite a bit of data in our service planning efforts, and it's kind of gotten much greater now given the pandemic. When we get into our slides here, let me get back over. So similar to Boston and everywhere else in the country and the world, we saw a big drop in ridership when the pandemic happened. You can see we used to carry about 1.2 million boardings a day, roughly about 2/3 of it on bus, about 1/3 on rail. And as Logan mentioned, a lot of the people that we carry are people who are essential workers who have to be at jobs, and a lot of them don't have another choice. And so you can see we did see a pretty big drop down in early mid-April, probably about 70% overall system-wide. But our bus system actually has been sort of growing back over the weeks since the pandemic happened. You can see that we had the Safer at Home orders of March 20th. We actually had to drop down to an enhanced Sunday level of service, which is about a 30% reduction in service on our system, partly because of ridership, partly obviously revenues. We actually get funded significantly from sales tax revenues. So when people aren't out there working, they're not out there buying stuff, they're not going to restaurants and bars and things like that, obviously our revenues are going to drop down significantly. And the third piece of that is actually because a lot of our frontline employees are operators, we're actually on COVID leave, either, you know, because they're quarantining for themselves or they had childcare issues they had to attend to. And so even if we wanted to put out a lot more service, we couldn't because we didn't have the staffing for it. And in fact, what we were doing was we were actually canceling about 20% of our runs every day. And there were sort of different runs depending on who was calling out. And so it became, you know, our system became pretty unreliable for people, you know, who need to get to work at a certain time, as Logan mentioned. So going to an enhanced Sunday service level at least gave us some stability there. Once we did that, you can see that our ridership started increasing. We had reopening beginning May 8th here in LA County. We actually had to add additional service, you know, on a weekly basis just to attend to the loads. And we finally went back into a new service change. We added back about, I'd say 10% more service just recently in June. And that's sort of our phase one of recovery. We really tried to rebalance loads again, kind of reset the system to, you know, kind of mid-crisis normal. And then obviously in LA, we sort of rolled back on our reopening. We weren't good at following directions from the county health. And so we did see a slight drop in our ridership, but since then we've seen it kind of come back up as well. And so, you know, trying to sort of stay ahead of the curve, no pun intended, you know, we really tried to identify ways to sort of forecast what we're going to be expecting to see over the next couple weeks, couple months, not even looking at years. But, you know, given the fact that everyone's crystal balls have been shattered relative to travel demand patterns and things like that, we sort of took to data and really looking at information in a lot of different ways to try to figure out how we can paint the picture of kind of the near-term future. Again, as I mentioned, our initial reduction was in April. That sort of baselined ourselves at that, you know, minus 30% service level. Since then, we've been adding trips here and there based on load reports, as well as the operators calling in to the bus operations control center. They would send us weekly reports of where they were experiencing overcrowding. Social media, it's a great, you know, place to get a lot of information. And so we were sort of triangulating our data around, you know, the data that we get from the APCs, automatic passenger counters for loads, the operator reports, the social media, and then also starting to look at some economic indicators as well, and sort of kind of trying to figure out, okay, where are all of these different data sources telling us we need to add service? And then we have to continue to track Safer at Home orders and reopening phases because we want to be ahead of, for example, kids returning back to school. We carry quite a bit of high school kids and so forth. Want to make sure that we put the service back out there on the lines that we need to anticipate people going back to school. Here in LA, we're not in-person class, at least until probably after the winter break. So we were originally going to put in the additional service for school kids in August, but we're sort of pushing that out to probably our December service change. Number 4 there, it says build back system based on principles established through NextGen. NextGen, we're undergoing a system restructure, a system redesign over the past 2 years. It's called NextGen. It's been a pretty big effort. It's very data driven, but very sort of outreach and engagement driven as well. And what we felt like, and what the board told us, is that if we're going to change the bus system anyways, why not build back to that bus system, right? Why build back to the network that we currently have or had, and then change it again, you know, 3 months later? So we're still going through public outreach on NextGen. In fact, this weekend, last week, we're holding 6 public hearings on our service changes, which is pretty interesting because they're all virtual, obviously. So we've had to really figure out how to do outreach and engagement during the pandemic. Luckily, before the pandemic, we had a couple months that we could do some robust workshops and stakeholder meetings and so forth. So we had a lot of good information at that time already in terms of what people thought about our network restructure. And so we're able to kind of adjust the plan according to that information, and then now take it back out to the public virtually to share the changes that we've made and hopefully get adoption and approval so that we can start making changes in December. And then finally, number 5, it's like what Logan mentioned, you don't have time to build new systems and put new hardware and software and figure out new ways of doing things. Well, you have to figure out new ways of doing things, but you have to figure out ways of doing things with what you have. And so, we're learning to be more nimble. We used to do a service change once every 6 months, and it would take us 6 months to get ready for a service change. Now, as I mentioned, we've done 2 service changes over the past 5 months or so. So we're kind of learning how to kind of do things differently, not cut corners, but figure out what you need to understand and know in order to make changes that you know that you have to make for the public. So bus recovery plan phasing, this changes every couple months or so, depending on where we are. But what you see on the left-hand side, we started out in April with our enhanced Sunday level service. As I mentioned, we made a change in June that brought us back up to 20% reduction on the bus side. You can see the different aspects of what we've done within the orders being lifted, so to speak. School's back and starting NextGen, that's sort of our phase 2. Again, we thought we were going to do that in August, but we pushed that out to December. We'll continue to track the stay-at-home orders, continue to talk to the schools to see what their plans are for in-person schools and so forth. But we do expect to do changes within December. If nothing else, we need to start implementing NextGen, assuming it's approved, because we're restructuring the route network. And the way we see it is that what we learned pre-pandemic during the NextGen planning phase was where the major travel flows are, where our origins and destinations are, major, transfer points, where people want to go when people want to travel. And we really learned that our system is somewhat misaligned because we haven't changed our system significantly over the past 25, 30 years. And since then, there's been a lot of new people and a lot of new places here in LA. LA is continuing to grow and change. And so we need to change our network to reflect that and be more relevant in terms of travel patterns. And we expect that those travel patterns are the same after the pandemic. It's just, the question is, how many people are going to be making that travel when, and then how many of those people are going to return back to transit? And that's a really important question. And then phase 4 gets into sort of next year. So this slide was actually for the board. So I had to show that we're going to grow back service levels. We used to be at 7 million 7 million hours of service every year. Hopefully we'll be able to get back to 6.5 million. And so, I mentioned it's really important to understand when and who are going to be returning back to transit. And so Mr. John Gordon that I see here on my screen, he's actually signed a contract with Transit App. So they're actually our Metro app at this point. And so far the partnership's been really promising. They've given us some survey data that they've captured. You can see a couple, survey slides here from their presentation. At what point do you think you'll resume using public transit as often as you did before COVID-19? And so you can see that there are a lot of people that are already using transit, and about over 25% are planning to use it during stage 1. So it's really, at this point and slightly beyond. So when you add that up, it's about 50%, but I think their overall survey results showed that about 75% of people were still using transit. Some were using it less, but others were using it pretty much the same because they do need to use transit to get to work. in the past week for what purpose to use transit. So you can see some trip purposes there. That really helps us because we need to know, are these people going to essential work? Are they doing non-essential things? When do they travel? Because if you're working, depending on your industry, your start times are at different times, your shift times are different. So we need to know that to be able to anticipate when the demand's going to occur. We also did our own survey. A couple slides from that. You can see here, we had about 11,000 responses from an online survey that we did. The one on the left-hand side is really interesting. If you look, it talks about sort of telecommuting versus not telecommuting, and then people who lost their jobs or furloughed. And again, understanding how many of these people are going to come back to transit is critical. So you can see, the percentage of people who are working from home, the people who are still going to work as part-time, and then afterwards, what are they anticipating? If you see on the right, with the 23% there in red, employers will allow you to work from home, stay-at-home orders. When the stay-at-home orders are discontinued, about 23% are expecting to be telecommuting even after the pandemic. So, that ridership we probably lost, but there are 9% that are planning to go back to work. And so those are 9% of respondents that we can potentially capture if we do what they need us to do in order to feel safe and comfortable on the vehicles. And then you have, again, the 21% who aren't quite sure. So, right there's about 30% of those people who are telecommuting that we can capture back as long as we do what we need to do to satisfy their needs. And so some of the things that we need to keep in mind are on the right-hand side in terms of enhanced cleaning and disinfecting, wiping down vehicles, reducing crowding. As Logan mentioned, crowding is a critical issue. It's sort of the Achilles heel at this time, with transit, because it goes against transit, right? Not being able to put a lot of people on a bus. But we do need to address that issue to make people safe and comfortable. And then we do have a pretty significant homelessness issue, and that's been actually exacerbated through the pandemic. There's been a lot of vacant seats on our subway system, on our light rail system, on our buses, and so they're getting sort of filled up with homeless people, especially when you have hot weather, and then we had a period of pretty rainy, cold weather as well. And so we need to continue to address that issue as well. And then fares are another issue. And so when we get into some of the data that we've been capturing, we usually push out data on a monthly basis in terms of our ridership that's required through MTD. We started pushing it out on a weekly basis. It's not at 100% of our sort of processing. So it takes quite a bit to process it, and you want to have a significant sample in order to get something statistically significant that we push up to FTA. But for our planning purposes, we started doing sort of informal weekly dumps of our APC data and kind of estimating out our ridership. And so you can see on the left-hand side, just a real summary, sort of Power BI snapshot on our ridership by week ending. It does tell you the sample size that we have there. So we want to make sure that we at least get to 95, 97% sample size. If not, we're losing a lot of data, in which case, our calculations are off. And so sometimes we use a rolling 2-week average. For example, if we look at Saturday and Sunday service, if you only have 1 day's worth of sample, you're not going to get 100% sampling count from our buses, even though we have 100% APC, because they're not always working. Sometimes people are not logged on and so forth. So we'll do a rolling 2-week average for Saturday and Sundays. But for weekdays, we have 5 days to be able to collect the data, and we're able to get roughly about, you can see there, 97 or so percent sample size. And on the right-hand side, we take all that data, we crunch it all the way down to the stop level by line, by direction, by trip, right down to the sort of the core data. And we calculate our max loads. And so we'll check this on a weekly basis. We'll look at our load analysis by trip, by line, by direction at the max load point. And you can see that in this dashboard, we're able to put sort of the trips into crowding bins, so you see there loads of less than 15 people, 15 to I can't see here, 20 people and so forth. So it gives us, in terms of planning and scheduling, a better idea as to what lines at what time periods are experiencing loads at different levels. And so we did try to keep loads at around, I'd say, initially 15 boardings on a 40-foot bus, maybe 30 people, 25, 30 people on a 60-foot Arctic. But as you saw with the ridership increase, we had to sort of increase our informal loading standard to 50% initially, which was basically 20 people on a 40-foot bus. Now we have to control it to kind of between 50 and 75% because the ridership's increasing so much, but we don't have sort of the funding resource, and we don't have the staffing levels to be able to add too much service out there. So it's this constant juggling act, sort of moving trips from one line and time period and direction to another line and time period and direction to be able to sort of balance that load between 50 and 75%. We're also looking at speed. When we did the service change in June, we took advantage of the speed improvements that we have here in LA. You can see a couple of snapshots here, kind of tracking our speeds on each line by time period and location. And then on the right-hand side, you can see sort of the change in speed, right? The delta between our sort of pre-COVID time period to whatever reference week or days that you want to take a look at. And so this shows you sort of where we've gained in terms of speed improvements and where we've kind of dropped down. And we're able to adjust the speeds a bit on our system when we did the June service changes to take advantage of this. Some of the other things that we're looking at, and this is pretty interesting, we're pulling LBS data, location-based services data, and we're trying to figure out, kind of keeping an eye on where we start seeing markets emerge, right? And so if you look at this snapshot here, this is one way for us to look at the data. On the left-hand side, you can select a location. We selected downtown LA right there. And then it tells you sort of pre-pandemic on the left-hand sort of isochrome map versus the reference week right there, how many people are traveling to that location, right? And you have some statistics on the top that tell you, average weekly, movements and what the distance is in terms of people moving. This doesn't show a lot of change right here because we're looking at pre-pandemic to today. And as I mentioned, our ridership has gone back quite a bit. This has nothing to do with transit only. This is actually all people who are pinging around with their cell phones and mobile devices. But, what you see out there in terms of traffic and things like that is that a lot of people are returning back to the streets. And so you're seeing sort of more movement going on now, still less kind of long distance moving, because long distance moving is really, they're really sort of indicators of a lot of commuters, right? People going from some, either a suburb or some residential area to a business park or an employment center. So you see less long distance trips, especially initially during the pandemic. But you see a lot of kind of short distance trips. And those are things that you do on a daily basis to go to the grocery store, the pharmacy, get your supplies, like kind of all your daily activities, as well as a lot of the essential workers, because essential workers generally don't travel that far away from their home to get to a job at a retail outlet or a service type of job or whatnot. So, the kind of short distance trips sort of remained through the pandemic, but the long distance trips were the ones that were dropping more significantly. And so that's important for us to keep an eye on in terms of watching what lines that we expect are going to be impacted more or less through the pandemic. And you can select it by corridor, you can select it by whatever you want. You just select these little hexagons and go at it with the data. This one here, it's pretty interesting. This is, oh, I'm sorry. This was just an animation of that one there. So you can see on the sort of little bar graphs on the top, The average distance when we first started with the pandemic dropped down significantly, like I said, but then since then it's grown back to almost kind of the same average trip distance that we used to see pre-pandemic. And again, this is all travel, so all modes. It's not just transit modes. And then the other thing that we're tracking is also kind of activity by market. And what I mean by market is, you know, if you look at the dining industry, retail industry, you know, travel industry and so forth, they're all listed there kind of on the little legend on the left-hand chart there. And you can see the trends in terms of movement within those different markets on the graph in the middle. You can look into it more closely into sub-markets. So if you look at retail, you can drop that into big box retail. You can drop it to clothing stores, children's stores, malls, you name it. Dining the same way, casual, fast casual, buffets, whatever you want to look. And then you can actually get down to the brand level. And what I mean by the brand level is if you go, you know, retail to clothing stores, to Gap or H&M or whatever, or you go down to big box retail, you can look at Home Depot, Lowe's specifically. And so you can identify that, and all the little data points on the map there are the actual locations of each of these places, these brands, right? These stores. You can just select Starbucks if you want to and see all the Starbucks in the county and see what the activity is going to the Starbucks. As I mentioned, Home Depot and Lowe's. This is critical for us here in LA for two reasons. For me, in terms of travel, I want to know where people are going. And if I know, you know, what type of retail or what type of sort of markets they're going to, I can get an understanding of whether or not these markets are sort of essential markets, you know, like grocery stores and things like that, or sort of not as essential. So you know, if people are making trips regularly to these places or not regularly, right? And you also know about generally, you know, how many employees are going to go there, generally what their shift times are and so forth. So we track it for kind of activity, movement activity for service planning, but we're also looking at it as a leading indicator for our sales tax receipts, because we don't get sales tax receipts until about a month or two after the month end. And here in LA, we get funded by 2% sales tax. And 2% sales tax used to equate to roughly $3 billion. And our budget is pre-pandemic was $8 billion a year, large capital program. But $3 billion out of $8 billion is a pretty significant number. And so we need to track the sales tax closely to sort of see or forecast out when we expect to have our revenues come back. And then we can start planning for additional services if that's the priority of the board, you know, and the executive staff. And so we do that. You can see system-wide there. On the right-hand side, I selected out Vermont Avenue, one of our major corridors, goes through Koreatown and so forth. And so you see a lot more travel staying within that area. And again, a lot of essential workers, a lot of kind of daily movements around there, even though, you know, county-wide, we saw a big drop in movement there. So again, it's important for us to look at our corridors, look at our major travel nodes or destinations, and see what the trends are so that we can start pre-planning services on those corridors or to those major destinations as markets start emerging back. So that's the end of my slideshow. I'm going to turn it back over. Let's see.
Thanks so much. Guys, I'm going to turn off recording now.